Chapter 1. The Widow's Last Waltz. The ballroom of Chateau Belfort glittered with chandeliers and champagne. Beneath the gilded ceiling, the ghosts of a bygone era danced one last time to the strains of a string quartet. This was not merely another charity gala thrown by the idle rich of Provence. It was a farewell. Lady Octavia Worsley, the elegant widow of industrial magnate Harold Worsley, had announced she was selling the estate and retiring from public life. At 72, Lady Octavia still turned heads. Clad in silver silk, her posture regal and movements graceful, she gave the impression of a woman untouched by time. But those closest to her knew better. Grief had frozen her in place, and tonight was an attempt at closure. "She waltzes like she's still in mourning," whispered Yvette Morel, her longtime maid, to a footman, "like she's dancing with his ghost." The waltz ended, and applause followed. Lady Octavia gave a half curtsy, nodded at the musicians, and excused herself to the library, the only room in the chateau that still bore her late husband's scent, wood polish, Turkish tobacco, and ink. Minutes later, a scream shattered the evening. The guests surged toward the sound, heels clicking, pearls jangling, voices rising. In the grand library, Lady Octavia lay sprawled in front of the fireplace, a silver gown fanned like a frozen ripple, a toppled chair, a shattered teacup. Her eyes, open but blank, stared toward the ornate grandfather clock that had, famously, never lost a second in 42 years. But tonight it had stopped. At precisely 9:36 p.m., Yvette stood in the doorway, trembling. I brought her the chamomile, like always. And then I saw her like this. Dr. Paul Vernet was first to kneel beside the body. "No pulse," he murmured, "but no sign of violence. My God, could it have been her heart? Or her grief?" someone muttered behind him. Inspector Jules Martin, of the local gendarmerie, arrived within the hour, summoned by an agitated Baron Leclerc, the estate's co-trustee. Martin's moustache twitched with disapproval as he surveyed the room, pausing at the grandfather clock. "Who touched the clock?" No one answered. "I want everyone to remain on the property until I say otherwise," he announced. "This is not an open and shut death." Lady Octavia was not only wealthy, she was careful. I do not believe she died by chance. By midnight, rumors coiled like smoke through the halls. Some said it was poison, others whispered about a curse. A few recalled an old scandal involving Lady Octavia's husband, who had died under mysterious circumstances during a hunting trip in 1929. But one guest, seated calmly in the drawing-room with a tisane and a perfectly arched eyebrow, was already piecing together what others missed: Hercule Poirot. He had not intended to attend the gala at all. He disliked such spectacles. Too loud, too proud. But a letter from Lady Octavia, sent weeks before, had piqued his interest. "Monsieur Poirot, I have recently come into the possession of something curious. I fear I am being watched. If anything happens to me, please come to Belfort. There are things only you will notice." He had pocketed the letter with a frown, and nearly forgotten it, until a second envelope arrived, containing a simple gold locket. Inside, a photograph of Harold Worsley. And behind the photograph, tucked almost imperceptibly, a miniature brass cog. Now, with Lady Octavia dead and the grandfather clock, her late husband's invention, frozen at 9:36, Poirot suspected that this Clockwork Widow had not passed into the night naturally. He gazed at the locket once more, then rose. "It is time," he said aloud, "to awaken the little grey cells." Chapter 2. The Clock That Lied. The early hours of the morning descended with a hush over Chateau Belfort. The once bustling ballroom had fallen silent, the musicians long since dismissed, the guests confined to their chambers by polite but firm insistence from Inspector Martin. Yet in the library, the fire still crackled low, throwing amber light onto the bookshelves, and the unmoving figure of Lady Octavia, now respectfully covered by a cream sheet. Poirot stood near the hearth, his hands behind his back, his eyes moving in slow, deliberate arcs across the room. Beside him, Inspector Martin scribbled notes into a leather-bound folio, the scratch of his pen growing louder in the quiet. "You are certain no one touched the clock?" Poirot asked again, his tone neither accusatory nor casual, but exact. Martin sighed. "Every guest swears it. Yvette, the maid, insists she found it like this. Stopped at 9:36. Poirot stepped closer to the grandfather clock. The time still read 9:36, hands unmoved. A beautiful piece of craftsmanship. Brass pendulum, dark walnut casing, a tiny plaque at the base, reading, "Worsley & Co. Precision beyond time." "May I?" Poirot gestured toward the mechanism. Martin gave a short nod. Poirot opened the lower cabinet and examined the pendulum and weight chains. Nothing appeared forced or jammed. No snapped gears or bent arms. His fingers hovered over the housing for a beat, then reached into his inner coat pocket and retrieved the tiny brass cog that had come inside the locket. He held it beside the mechanism. "This gear, it matches the Worsley configuration. But this one is not aged, it is new. It belongs to a copy, not the original." Martin turned. "A replica clock, perhaps," Poirot murmured, "or a replacement part inserted to change the behavior of the original." He slipped the cog back into his pocket, careful not to smudge its edges. "Tell me, mon ami, is it possible to stop this clock at an exact time without breaking it?" Martin frowned, then reluctantly admitted, "If you knew how it worked, yes. You could manipulate the escapement. But who here would know that?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept the room once more, this time resting on the broken teacup beside the armchair. He crouched to examine it. One porcelain fragment had a faint yellowish residue at the edge. He picked it up with a handkerchief. "Chamomile," said Martin from behind him. "The maid said it was her nightly ritual, has been for years." "Bien, but the scent." Poirot raised the fragment to his nose and paused. "There is something else, bitter, metallic." "Poison." Martin stepped forward. "We mustn't jump to conclusions, not yet." Poirot gestured to the empty teacup tray still sitting on a side table. There had been no second cup. She drank alone. That's what the maid claims. "And yet," Poirot said quietly, "her chair faces not the fire, but the second, across from it. Someone may have been sitting there watching her, or speaking to her." Martin looked toward the chair. It was angled just slightly, facing the windows now drawn with velvet curtains. a small indentation on the cushion, subtle but telling. Poirot moved to the fireplace mantel. An ornate set of brass bookends caught his attention. He gently tilted one, nothing, then the other. It wobbled slightly. Beneath it, a thin crease of paper. He extracted it, a torn page from a ledger, with only a few visible lines. 3 withdrawals between May and July. To an account in Zurich, name redacted. Final amount exceeds 12,000 francs. Poirot's brows lifted slightly. Curious. It appears the late Lady Worsley was still arranging finances recently. But why such secrecy? Martin read over his shoulder. That's a serious sum. Enough to provoke desperation in those with need. Poirot gently folded the slip and tucked it into a separate pocket. Tell me, Inspector, who inherits the estate? Martin cleared his throat. No official statement yet, but it's known that Lady Octavia had no children. Her husband's nephew, Francis Worsley, has lived on and off in the guest wing. And of course, Baron Leclerc. He's co-trustee of the estate. Others, well, there's the secretary, Miss Violette Renard, and the maid, Yvette Morel, who's been with Lady Octavia since before the war. Poirot tapped his chin. I see. And were there tensions among them? Martin hesitated. There were rumors. The Baron and the nephew never saw eye to eye. Miss Reynard was said to be protective of the old woman's affairs. Overly so, some say. And the maid, well, I suppose anyone who serves the same mistress for 30 years has feelings. Complicated ones. Poirot stepped back, surveying the room once more, as if drawing an invisible grid across every object. Inspector, might I make a request? Of course. Let no one leave the estate, and please have the guests assemble in the dining salon at 10 o'clock. I will begin my own inquiries there. You think the murderer is among them? Poirot gave a faint smile. Oh, mon ami, I do not think I know. Chapter 3. Masks at the breakfast table. At precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, the guests assembled in the dining salon, seated around a table more suited to a royal banquet than a murder inquiry. The long oak stretch, flanked by high-backed velvet chairs, was awash with sunlight, though the warmth of the day did little to dissolve the chill that had settled into the chateau. Poirot arrived last, stepping into the room with the solemnity of a conductor taking the stage. His eyes did not wander idly. They studied, assessed, calculated. Mes amis, he began gently, I thank you for your presence. I do not intend to alarm you, but it is my duty to inform you that Lady Octavia's death, though not yet officially declared unnatural, is highly suspicious. And I believe someone in this room knows more than they admit. A ripple of discomfort passed down the table like a breeze. Cups paused mid-air. Forks hesitated over scrambled eggs. He continued, Let us not be enemies. I will ask questions, you will answer. We are for now only clarifying the shadows. One by one, the masks began to appear. Francis Worsley, seated nearest the window, exuded the polished indifference of the idle aristocracy. He was in his early 40s, handsome in a slightly decaying sort of way, like a painting left too long in the sun. He raised a brow and said, with a yawn, Suspicious, you say? My aunt had a weak heart and a stronger sense of drama. Perhaps her clock simply chose an operatic time to stop. Poirot nodded. Indeed, and yet, monsieur, A weak heart does not usually halt with such symbolic timing. Francis gave a crooked grin. You know her then. Everything was a symbol. Beside him sat Baron Leclerc, stiff and waxen, as if sculpted from entitlement and legal documents. Symbol or not, he said, Lady Octavia was a meticulous woman. She would never let such an irregularity, her clock stopping, go unnoticed unless something interfered. I agree with your implication, Monsieur Poirot, distasteful as it is. Poirot tilted his head. And you, monsieur, you managed her estate. Jointly, the Baron corrected, with Lady Octavia, and later, with her secretary, all proper, all accountable. Yet, accounts, as I understand, were accessed recently. Withdrawals to a Swiss bank. Do you know of these? The Baron's neck stiffened. Certainly not. And if such transactions occurred, they are news to me. I suggest you speak to Miss Renard. She handled the finer details. Violette Renard sat opposite, clutching her gloves in her lap, as if they might leap away. She was a woman of 30, plain but poised, with a voice that barely rose above the silverware. Lady Octavia asked me to make several transfers over the past month, she said softly. She said they were precautionary, for her own peace of mind. Precautionary against what? Poirot asked. Violette hesitated. She wouldn't say. Only that she no longer trusted the walls. A murmured gasp circled the table. She believed someone was watching her? Poirot prompted. Violette nodded. Yes, especially after receiving a letter she wouldn't let me see. Poirot arched an eyebrow. And this letter? Has it been found? No, Violette said, her voice taut. She kept it in her writing desk. I checked this morning. It's gone. Poirot turned his gaze to Yvette Morel, the maid, standing silently near the sideboard. Her eyes were puffy, her apron stained with coffee. She had served Lady Octavia since 1911, and looked as though the last 24 hours had aged her further. You found her? Poirot asked gently. Yvette nodded. She was in her chair, like always, her book on the armrest. The tea spilled. I ran. I called the Baron first, then Dr. Vernet. And did you see anyone leaving the library? No, monsieur, but the curtains. They were drawn. I swear I didn't do it. Madame always liked them open at night. She said the dark made her nervous. Poirot frowned. So someone closed them after she sat down. I believe so. Merci, mademoiselle. Dr. Vernet, seated near the foot of the table, cleared his throat. If I may, I performed a preliminary examination. There were no visible signs of struggle. But I cannot explain the suddenness of her death. Unless it was assisted. A tranquil poison, perhaps. Poirot offered. Possibly. But we'll need the post-mortem. Poirot clasped his hands. And finally, did anyone else, anyone not among us, visit Lady Octavia recently? There was a long pause. Then Francis Worsley spoke again, his voice low. She had a visitor last week. I didn't see him, but I heard the name. Nicholas Fexley. The name fell like a coin into a wishing well, followed by a hollow silence. Who is this Vexley? Asked Poirot. Violette swallowed hard. A former engineer. He once worked for Worsley and Co. long ago. There was a scandal. Poirot narrowed his eyes. And was he not also involved in the design of the Worsley clocks? Baron Leclerc spoke now. his voice unusually quiet. Yes, but he disappeared after Harold Worsley's death. No one heard from him in 20 years. Until now, Poirot murmured. Then perhaps it is not just clocks that have been restarted. Chapter 4. The Man Who Watched the Pendulum. Though he had technically arrived the night before, Poirot's true entrance, as only he would define it, occurred the next morning. After the breakfast gathering, he did not linger in the salon, nor retire for coffee like the others. Instead, he requested the use of Lady Octavia's writing room. It was a chamber of elegance and order, with lacquered walnut furniture, cream curtains tied in perfect symmetry, and a neat row of notebooks marked in her precise hand. Everything, except the woman herself, was intact. He paced slowly, tapping his fingertips together. The clock on the desk, another Worsley original, ticked smoothly. It was a smaller cousin of the great-grandfather clock that had stopped the night before. Poirot leaned down, watching the pendulum swing. Tick, tick, tick. Then he turned to the fireplace, where a single painting hung. Harold Worsley, captured in oils, with dark, intense eyes, and a hand resting on a mechanical model of a gear-driven clock. His stare seemed to follow Poirot across the room. "Mon cher Harold," Poirot murmured. "Even in death, you observe." A soft knock at the door. Violette Renaud stepped in, carrying a slim folder. "Monsieur Poirot, I thought you should have this. It's Lady Octavia's correspondence from the last 2 weeks. She kept duplicates. These are not in the desk. They were in her private safe. I have the key. Merci, Mademoiselle Henard. That is very good of you." Poirot accepted the folder with a nod, watching her eyes as he did. They flickered downward, not from guilt, but exhaustion. He had seen that look before, many times on the faces of overburdened secretaries, guarding the reputations of their employers long after death. "May I ask," he said, motioning for her to sit, "what was your relationship with Madame Worsley?" Violette sat stiffly. "Professional. I was her assistant, nothing more." "But not nothing less either, I think," Poirot said gently. "You stayed in this house long after most staff rotated out. You were trusted." Violette hesitated. She told me things. Sometimes she'd say them as if thinking aloud, in riddles. Such as, she would speak of time as though it were dangerous, that it can be manipulated not just by clocks, but by people. She used to say, when someone wants to kill you, they don't attack your heart, they attack your perception. Poirot's brow arched, curious, philosophical even. And this Nicholas Vexley, did she mention him? Violette grew tense. "Only once, last Tuesday," she said. "I think he's here again. Harold was right to fear him. That's all." Poirot leaned back in the chair, hands resting in a pyramid beneath his chin. Did Harold Worsley fear many people? No, only Vexley, as far as I know. He said the man had a gift for machines, but no conscience. And yet this Vexley was never formally accused of wrongdoing? No, Violette said quietly. But Harold died on a hunting trip with him. That same weekend, one of their prototype clocks, an unusual piece with a triple pendulum, was destroyed in a fire. Vexley disappeared the next day. Poirot gave a soft hum. A vanishing man, a ruined invention, and a suspicious death, all neatly timed. He stood walking to the desk. Inside the folder, He found a carbon copy of the letter Octavia had sent to him, along with several others. One to a solicitor in London, one to a clockmakers' guild, and one, oddly, to the widow of a Worsley factory foreman who had died years ago. Each letter contained veiled language, hints at financial irregularities, unspoken debts, unfinished business. It was as if Lady Octavia had been tying off threads she feared might unravel violently. Poirot turned back to Violette. "And tell me, mademoiselle, who else knew of these letters?" "No one," she said. "I swear it. I typed them myself and handed them to the courier." "Ah, yes," Poirot said with a slight nod. "The courier. Was it the usual man?" Violette froze. "No. Now that you say it, no. The usual man was on leave. This one, he was different, younger, nervous." Poirot's voice lowered. "Did he wear gloves?" "I think so." Poirot closed the folder. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. Please send Monsieur Francis Worsley to me next." She stood, visibly relieved to leave. As she exited, Poirot returned to the desk and placed the brass cog from the locket beside the ticking clock. The tick faltered. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Merde," he whispered. "It is not a replica after all." A moment later, Francis strolled, in his hands in his pockets, the scent of expensive cologne preceding him like a herald. "You rang, detective?" he asked, half amused. Poirot gestured for him to sit. "Just a few questions, monsieur." Francis flopped into the chair. "By all means." "You lived in this house on and off for how many years?" "Too many." "Did you ever assist your uncle with his clocks?" Francis chuckled. "Hardly. I could barely tie my shoes at 10, and he had me watching gear ratios. I left the tinkering to the men with spectacles and lab coats." "But you understood the business enough to know it kept the lights on and the brandy flowing." Poirot leaned forward. "And did you know Nicholas Vexley?" Francis's expression faltered just for a second. "We met. He came to dinner a few times. Odd fellow. Never blinked. Always fiddling with a stopwatch." "Did he speak with you recently?" Francis shook his head. "No, but if he's back, well, I wouldn't be surprised. Bad pennies and all that." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And tell me, do you believe your aunt feared him?" Francis looked away. "I think she feared being forgotten. That's worse than any man." Poirot stood, motioning toward the door. "Merci, monsieur. That will be all for now." As Francis left, Poirot returned to the desk once more. He opened the lower drawer. A scrap of something thin and metallic lay beneath the paper lining. A clock hand, broken at the base. Chapter 5. Truth in the Gaps. By late afternoon, a dense stillness had settled over Chateau Belfort, the kind of hush that accompanies the unspoken knowledge that something terrible has happened, and worse still, may be revealed. Outside, storm clouds gathered like voyeurs above the estate, casting long shadows into the drawing room where Poirot had chosen to conduct his interviews. The setup was precise. One chair in the middle, one opposite, and a silver tea service, prepared, not to comfort, but to observe. Poirot, ever the orchestrator, understood that people spoke differently when a teacup occupied their hands. They lied differently too. The first to sit was Baron Leclerc. His mouth was drawn tight as though each question Poirot posed required authorization from some unseen superior. You managed Lady Octavia's estate, monsieur. What did that involve precisely? The Baron folded his hands. I oversaw trust disbursements, managed correspondence with legal counsel, and ensured compliance with her late husband's will. Did you approve her recent financial activity? The transfers to Zurich? No, Leclerc said flatly. Those were conducted without my involvement. Poirot leaned slightly forward, and yet, as co-trustee, you were required to co-sign any withdrawal above 5,000 francs. That is documented in the will. The Baron hesitated. She must have bypassed procedure, perhaps by persuading the bank. Or, Poirot interrupted, perhaps someone forged your signature. Leclerc's eyes flashed. Are you accusing me of negligence? No, Poirot said with calm authority. I am observing that your name appears on a transfer slip. The ink is fresh, the penmanship less so. He let the words linger. The Baron rose stiffly. I shall await your findings, monsieur. And with that, he exited, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and sweat. Next came Miss Violette Renard. Hands folded tightly in her lap. You were present during most of Lady Octavia's final hours. Poirot began. Yes, she replied. I organized the dinner, ensured her medications were in order, and left her with her tea around 8:30. Did she receive any messages that evening? Violette paused. Yes. A note was slipped under the door around 7. She read it, burned it in the fireplace, and said, It's him. Did she say a name? No. Only that. Then she requested chamomile. Poirot nodded. You say you left her alone. I did. I had to prepare a call for her solicitor in the morning. Poirot's voice softened. And did you hear anything unusual after you left her? I heard the clock chime. Once, not twice, no. Just once. It was strange. I thought perhaps it was misaligned. But Lady Octavia didn't like it chiming after dark. It was set to silent mode. Poirot made a note. You are observant, mademoiselle, perhaps dangerously so. She blinked, uncertain whether it was a compliment or a warning. Then she stood and departed, visibly shaken. The next to enter was Yvette Morel, the maid. Her uniform was crisp, but her voice quivered with guilt or grief, or both. Tell me, Mademoiselle Yvette, Poirot began kindly. What was your routine with Madame each evening? I prepared her tea at 8:30, set out her shawl, drew the curtains if she asked. Did she ask you to draw them last night? Yvette shook her head quickly. No, she hated them closed, said it made the room feel like a tomb. And yet, they were drawn. I didn't do it, monsieur, I swear. Poirot looked at her a long moment. Then someone else was in that room after you. Yvette's lower lip trembled. I heard something, just before I found her. A click, like something winding. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Winding? Yes, like a clock. He did not press further. Thank you, that will be all for now. Yvette left with uncertain steps, clutching her apron. Poirot poured himself a cup of tea, letting the room sit in silence. The tick of the mantel clock filled the void. He waited precisely 5 minutes before calling the next. Francis Worsley returned, feigning boredom. Back so soon? Poirot gestured to the chair. You are most entertaining, monsieur. I could not resist. Francis lounged into the seat. Ask away then. Did you see Lady Octavia after dinner? I did, Francis said. Around 9. She was in her library staring at the fire. Did you speak? I tried. She waved me away, said she was expecting someone. Poirot's brow arched. Someone? She didn't name them, just said, he's always late. I assumed she meant her husband. Spiritually, of course. She was in one of her moods. And did you leave her alone? Francis shrugged. I went to the study, poured a drink, heard the clock stop. That's when the maid screamed. Poirot took a sip of tea. And tell me, did your uncle ever share his designs with you? The clocks? Not a one. Pity, Poirot said. He was a genius. Did you know he once said that time could be used as a weapon? Francis scoffed. He also said a man's soul could be measured in gears. He wasn't right in the head. Poirot made a mental note of that. As Francis left, Poirot allowed the silence to settle again. 4 interviews, 4 distinct rhythms, but one thread bound them all. The unspoken knowledge that something in Belfort had been tampered with. Not just a clock, but truth itself. Chapter 6. The Hour That Didn't Exist. The rain arrived at dusk, soft at first, like a whisper behind closed curtains, then harder, driven by wind. Chateau Belfort seemed to exhale under the downpour, its walls absorbing the weight of something long withheld. Poirot remained in the study, surrounded by notes, sketches of the clock mechanisms, and the disassembled brass cog resting on a velvet cloth. His eyes were fixed not on the objects before him, but inward, following the narrow corridors of deduction, where truth often hides in overlooked recesses. A knock interrupted his reverie. It was Inspector Martin, trench coat damp, hat in hand. Poirot, he said, stepping inside without ceremony. We may have our culprit. Poirot arched a brow. Ah? Martin held up a small vial, sealed in evidence wrap. Dr. Vernet found this under a pile of ashes in the library's fireplace. Poison. Cyanide likely. And we now have a motive to go with it. Do tell, Poirot murmured. Martin set down a slim stack of documents. These are employment records from Worsley & Co., dug up from their archives. Guess who worked there as a junior engineer for a brief period in 1928? Yvette Morel. Poirot's expression did not change, but his silence deepened. Martin continued. She never disclosed it. There's even a report signed by Harold Worsley himself, noting her termination under suspicious circumstances. Something about unauthorized access to prototype schematics. Poirot's fingers steepled. Interesting. Go on. We think she was involved with Nicholas Vexley. There are references to an unnamed assistant in the company's incident reports. One, who vanished after the fire in the workshop, could have been her. Perhaps they were more than colleagues. Love or betrayal? Poirot asked quietly. Could be both, Martin said. And maybe Lady Octavia discovered it. Fired Yvette discreetly years ago, but never forgot. And now, with Vexley possibly returning to collect a debt or threaten her, Yvette panicked. Poirot rose from his chair and walked to the window. Rain streaked the panes like tear trails. Inspector, may I ask, have you interviewed Yvette since discovering this? Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first. Then let us not wait, Poirot said. But with delicacy. If she is guilty, she will fold under pressure. If she is not, she may break anyway. They found Yvette in the kitchen, drying teacups that had not been used since the morning. She looked up, startled at their entrance. "Monsieur Poirot, Inspector." Martin set the vial on the table. "Do you know what this is?" Her eyes widened. "Poison? Found in the fireplace, next to where your mistress died." Yvette paled. "And this," Martin added, placing the document folder beside it, "confirms you worked for her husband's company. You never told us." Yvette's hands trembled. A cup slipped from her grasp and shattered on the stone floor. "I didn't think it mattered," she whispered. "That was a lifetime ago." Poirot stepped forward gently. "You were terminated. Why?" "Okay, didn't steal anything," she blurted. "That's what they thought, that I helped Nicholas copy designs. But I didn't. I just typed reports." "You knew Vexley?" Martin pressed. Yvette nodded miserably. "He was brilliant and cruel. He charmed everyone. Even Harold trusted him for a time. Then came the fire, and Nicholas vanished. I was blamed by association. Did you ever see him again?" "Not until last week," she whispered. "He came to the servants' entrance, said he needed to speak with Lady Octavia. I told her, and she agreed, but she made me wait outside the room." "How long did he stay?" Poirot asked. 10 minutes, no more." "What did he say when he left?" Yvette's voice grew small. "Just one thing. She's changed her mind. She always does." Poirot and Martin exchanged a glance. "And last night," Martin asked, "did you poison her?" Yvette's head snapped up. "No, I would never. I loved her. She was cruel sometimes, but she took me in when no one else would. I never wanted her dead." Poirot looked closely at her face, then turned to Martin. "She is lying about something, yes, but not the murder." Martin sighed. "Then why the hidden history? Why conceal her past?" "Because she feared it would destroy her place here," Poirot answered. "People lie to protect many things. Status, memory, dignity. But poison? That is not her language." He turned to Yvette once more. "Go to your room, mademoiselle. Do not pack. Do not flee. But reflect on what was said and, more importantly, what was not." She nodded slowly, tears forming, and left the room in silence. Martin threw his hat down. "Well, that theory fell apart." "No," Poirot said calmly. "It served its purpose. We now know that Vexley visited her, and that he left without violence. So the question becomes, did he return?" Martin frowned. "And if not him, then who?" Poirot turned back to the rain-speckled window. "There was an hour last night, Inspector, between 8:30 and 9:30, when everything changed. The tea was poured, the curtains drawn, a letter burned, a clock stopped, and a woman died." He placed a hand lightly on the sill. "That hour does not yet exist in our narrative. It is missing, fabricated, a ghost hour." Martin crossed his arms. "So we look for someone who lives best in the shadows." "Precisely," Poirot said. "And we begin with the only person who claims to have seen nothing at all." Martin blinked. "You mean Dr. Vernet?" Poirot smiled. "Non, mon ami. I mean the man who lives among the clocks, but hears none of them tick." Chapter 7. A gentle tap on the glass. The storm passed in the early hours, leaving the sky a dull ash gray. A light mist clung to the gardens of Chateau Belfort, and dew silvered the hedges like frost. But inside, in the long corridor that led to the music room, a different kind of tension hung in the air. Thicker, unseen, but no less cold. Hercule Poirot stood at the window, watching the mist. A single gloved finger traced the edge of the glass. He was not admiring the landscape. He was watching for reflections. Behind him, in the grand piano's sheen, he could see the door slowly creak open. "Come in, Dr. Vernet," he said without turning. The physician paused, one foot just across the threshold. "You have a remarkable sense for footsteps, Monsieur Poirot." "No, no," Poirot replied with a faint smile. "Only for patterns." "And yours, doctor, are unusually quiet for a man with such a rigid spine." Vernet stepped fully inside, raincoat neatly folded over one arm, his dark tie perfectly symmetrical. "You asked to speak with me privately?" "Yes, please, sit." Vernet took the seat across from Poirot, his expression unreadable. His hands, however, were not. Long, careful fingers, surgeon's hands, no visible tremor. But the left thumb tapped against the coat in a slow rhythm. Anxious, perhaps, but trying not to show it. "I wanted to revisit your findings," Poirot began smoothly. "You examined Lady Octavia's body within minutes of her death." "I did. No external trauma, no contusions. Her complexion was pale but not flushed, eyes open. It seemed like a sudden cardiac arrest, but not a certainty." Vernet hesitated. "No, not a certainty." Poirot nodded slowly. "And when was the last time you saw her alive?" "Around 7 o'clock. She asked for a sedative prescription refill. I prepared it myself." Poirot turned toward the misted window. "You have known her a long time, doctor?" "Since 1941. I treated her husband for his insomnia. I became something of a family physician afterward." Poirot's voice softened. "Was she afraid of something lately? Did she confide in you?" Vernet's response came too quickly. "No. Not even when Nicholas Vexley returned. This time." There was a pause. Poirot did not look away from the window. "She mentioned him, briefly. She didn't say what he wanted, only that his return unsettled her." Poirot finally turned. "Doctor, do you know what I find most intriguing? I'm sure you'll tell me. You were the first on the scene, and yet you chose not to perform any meaningful analysis of the teacup. You assumed, perhaps too quickly, that her death was natural." Vernet frowned. "She was elderly, grief-stricken, under stress." Poirot's voice sharpened. "So you diagnosed emotion, not evidence." A silence bloomed between them. "I see," Vernet said finally. "You suspect me." "I suspect everyone," Poirot said. "That is the gift of caution. But let me pose a question." He rose and walked over to the piano, pressing a single key. A low note trembled through the air and died. "If one were to poison tea, just a trace, subtle and bitter, would it be easier to mask with sugar or with chamomile itself?" Vernet blinked. "Chamomile? It has a bitter aftertaste of its own." "Ah," Poirot smiled. "How convenient. And if one wanted to slow the body's response, not cause immediate death, but rather a delay, perhaps half an hour, what substance might one choose?" Vernet's tone turned wary. Why are you asking me this? Because the death occurred after 9, yet the tea was poured before 8:40. That is not cyanide. That is something more. Patient. Vernet rose. Are you accusing me of misdiagnosing poison or administering it? Poirot walked past him toward the door. Neither. Not yet. But I wonder why a man of science, when confronted with an unexplained death, did not demand an autopsy. I was waiting for the family to decide. There is no family, Poirot snapped, his voice still smooth but sharpened now with precision. And you knew that. Vernet stiffened. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Doctor, have you ever built a clock? Vernet looked puzzled. No. Pity. They teach you everything about how time works, and how people try to manipulate it. Poirot bowed his head slightly. Merci, doctor. That will be all. Vernet left in stiff silence. Poirot remained at the doorway. He waited. 15 seconds. 20. Then the creak. Francis Worsley stepped from the adjoining hallway, whistling. Eavesdropping, monsieur? Poirot asked without surprise. Francis offered a theatrical shrug. The walls here echo, monsieur. I was merely following them. You enjoy shadows, don't you? They've always been cooler than the spotlight, Francis said, grinning. Besides, Dr. Vernet looked flushed. Did you accuse him of smuggling cyanide in his stethoscope? Poirot smiled faintly. I made no accusations. I merely tapped the glass. See who cracks. Precisely. Francis folded his arms. You enjoy this, don't you? The games. Poirot tilted his head. No, monsieur, but I understand them, and when someone plays one poorly, they do not lose at cards. They lose at murder. The younger man's grin faltered slightly. And do you think I'm playing a game? Poirot stepped forward. I think you always have. The question is, whether this time, you played to win. Poirot turned away, leaving Francis standing alone in the mist-filled corridor, where reflections shifted on every pane of glass, and none could be trusted. Chapter 8. The Letter That Never Reached the Post. The following morning dawned not with clarity, but with fog, thick and unmoving, as though the earth itself hesitated to face the day. Chateau Belfort, shrouded in this spectral veil, felt even more like a stage awaiting its final act. But for Hercule Poirot, the play had only reached its second turning. He awoke earlier than usual and requested that no one disturb the estate's routine. The illusion of calm, he told Inspector Martin over breakfast, will lure the liar back into motion. Martin, still bleary-eyed and stirring his coffee with more aggression than necessary, sighed. And if no one takes the bait, Poirot gave a small smile, then they have already made their move. And indeed someone had. At precisely 9:14 a.m., Violette Renard knocked on the door to the study, pale and breathless. Monsieur Poirot, she whispered. Something is missing. Poirot stood at once. What is it, mademoiselle? The will, Lady Octavia's final will. It's gone. Within minutes the writing room was again a scene of scrutiny. The drawer where the will had been placed under lock, the key known only to Lady Octavia and Violette, now sat open, empty. Poirot examined the lock. No sign of force, no scratch marks, Not even the dust was disturbed. Someone had another key, he murmured. Martin joined them shortly after, his brow furrowed. Are we sure the will was even real? Violette's voice quavered. I typed it myself. She dictated every line. It was signed 2 weeks ago, and witnessed by Dr. Vernet and Yvette Morel. Poirot turned sharply. Then they must confirm its existence immediately. Within the hour, both were summoned. Vernet arrived first, arms crossed. Yes, I witnessed it. It seemed straightforward. Most of her estate was to be left to a foundation she was establishing, a home for war widows. Only a modest sum went to Francis Worsley. The Baron was to serve as executor. Poirot's eyes narrowed, and yet he did not know of this version. She kept it quiet, Vernet replied. Said she feared Francis might contest it. Moments later, Yvette entered. She clutched a handkerchief, eyes wary. I was there too. She made me bring in tea just before she signed it. She said she didn't trust lawyers to do the moral thing unless someone ordinary was watching. Poirot allowed himself a faint smile at that. Lady Octavia was wise in human nature. Martin folded his arms. And now it's gone. That makes this theft as suspicious as the death itself. Suspicious, yes, Poirot agreed. But more than that, it is timely. Violette sank into the nearest chair. She was going to mail a copy to her solicitor in London, but she never got the chance. Are you certain? She nodded. She left it with me to post the next morning. But when I looked just now, that envelope was still in her desk drawer. Opened, empty. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Then whoever stole the original stole the copy as well. They wanted to erase it completely. Martin grimaced. So what now? Now, Poirot said, we trace the fingerprints not just on what has vanished, but on what remains. He turned back to the desk, fingers moving over the writing surface, the drawer edges, the envelope tray. And there, tucked beneath, a blotting pad was something curious. A second envelope, sealed, addressed not to a solicitor, but to a name neither Martin nor Violette recognized. Mr. Edwin Pell, Sous Rue des Horloges, Geneva. Poirot's brow furrowed. He carefully unsealed it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, not typed, by Lady Octavia herself. Mr. Pell, I have reconsidered. The enclosed gear does not belong in any archive. It must be studied. It was never meant for domestic use. You were right to warn me years ago. Harold ignored you, and now I fear Nicholas will not. If you receive this letter, assume the worst and act accordingly. Octavia Worsley. There was no gear enclosed. Poirot looked up. Does anyone here know this name? Edwin Pell? Violette shook her head. No, I don't recognize it. Nor do I, Martin added. But Yvette froze. You do? Poirot asked, his voice soft but immediate. She nodded slowly. He was an engineer, like Vexley. He and Harold had a falling out long ago. Something about mechanical ethics, whatever that means. Harold called him a coward. Poirot folded the letter. Then we may assume that Pell was the voice. Of conscience, and that Lady Octavia, at the end, began to listen. Martin leaned in. You think this Pell might have known what was coming? Poirot didn't answer directly. Instead, he tapped the envelope. This was not stolen. Why? Maybe the thief didn't see it, or, Poirot said, they didn't know what it meant. He looked toward the doorway. Francis Worsley, I think, would not recognize this name, nor would the Baron. But Nicholas Vexley, he would. Martin frowned. So, if Vexley is involved. He is not just involved, Poirot said. He is the architect. The question is, did he kill her himself, or convince someone else to do it? Martin muttered. And all for a gear? Poirot looked down at the brass cog once more, then to the absent Will. No, my friend, he said quietly. Not just for a gear, for the secret inside it. Chapter 9. The Thread Beneath the Floorboards. The mist had begun to lift by late afternoon, but the tension within Chateau Belfort had only thickened. Poirot paced the long hallway outside the conservatory, hands clasped neatly behind his back. His expression was unreadable, but in his mind the threads had begun to tighten. What had appeared as loose coincidences were now crossing, forming knots. Each knot, he knew, connected to motive. And motive was everything. Inside the conservatory, Inspector Martin sat across from Francis Worsley, reviewing estate ledgers that Violette had reluctantly retrieved from the locked cabinet. They revealed modest expenses, staff wages, upkeep, travel receipts, nothing overtly damning. Until Poirot stepped in. Inspector, may I? He asked. Martin gestured toward the table. Be my guest. Poirot thumbed through the pages, eyes flicking past routine entries, until he stopped at a transaction dated just 5 days before Lady Octavia's death. A withdrawal for 13,000 francs, marked simply, Repayment, H.W. Gear Project. Francis Worsley, watching from the chair, paled. I've never seen that entry. Poirot looked up. No, but the initials are unmistakable. H.W. Harold Worsley. Francis scoffed, regaining his poise. It must have been something my aunt wanted covered privately. That project was ancient history. But why repay anything now? Poirot asked. And to whom? The money was withdrawn, not wired. It vanished into someone's hands. Francis said nothing. Poirot continued. And yet, it aligns curiously with the reappearance of Nicholas Vexley. Martin frowned. You think she paid him off? I think, Poirot replied, she attempted to, or believed she had. Perhaps, even under duress. Francis leaned forward now, voice edged with something not quite anger, something closer to fear. He hated her, you know. Vexley. Hated both my aunt and uncle. Said they stole his work. He used to call himself the true inventor behind Worsley & Co. I overheard it once, years ago. He was drunk. Said Harold's clocks were nothing but his blueprints whitewashed. Why didn't you ever tell her? Martin asked. Francis hesitated. She already knew, and she lived in fear of it surfacing. If the public found out the Worsley clocks weren't truly Harold's, if they believed he was a fraud, it would have ruined her and the company's legacy. Poirot gave a slow nod. Then we may presume that this gear, he said, patting the pocket where he still carried the brass cog, was more than mechanical. It was symbolic. Proof, perhaps, of a stolen design. Martin exhaled through his nose. So, we're looking at blackmail, not merely blackmail, Poirot said. Control. Whoever possessed that proof could command silence, influence wills, drive fear, perhaps even incite a death. There was silence for a moment. Then Poirot turned to Martin. "I would like to see the East Corridor." Martin blinked. "The East Corridor?" "Yes, where the archive rooms are. The ones Francis no longer uses." Francis rose at once. "That wing is closed. No one goes there." "Which makes it an excellent place," Poirot said gently, "for secrets to be hidden." They made their way through the drafty stone hall, the air colder than elsewhere in the chateau. Poirot's shoes echoed crisply against the marble as they approached a series of wooden doors, each marked by iron labels now faded with dust. Francis produced an old key. "I haven't opened this in years," he muttered. Inside the archive room, a thin film of dust coated everything. Wooden crates, bound ledgers, even a glass case once used to store prototypes. It smelled faintly of metal and time. Poirot moved, slowly, carefully. "Do not disturb anything, if you please." He scanned the shelves until he found a familiar shape, a broken casing. Gears spilled across the shelf like tiny corpses. "This was one of the prototype clockworks?" he asked. Francis nodded. "Yes, my uncle said it never worked properly. Too complex." He shelved it. Poirot knelt and examined the central chamber of the device. A cavity had been hollowed out, clearly not part of the original design. Inside, lined with velvet, was a circular impression. "Something was stored here," he said. "Something the size of—" He reached into his pocket and removed the brass cog. It matched perfectly. "Good Lord," Martin murmured. "It was never just a gear," Poirot said. "It was the keystone. The one piece of proof that connected every working clock in the Worsley design to Nicholas Vexley's name." Francis shook his head. "But why would she keep it?" Poirot looked up. "Because she was torn between preserving her husband's reputation and telling the truth. That is the nature of guilt, Monsieur Worsley. It weighs the soul." Poirot stood and turned to Martin. "We must now ask, who knew this gear still existed?" "Vexley," Martin said. "Yvette, perhaps." "More," Poirot said quietly. "I suspect the Baron knew. And perhaps even Dr. Vernet." Martin frowned. "Why him?" Poirot walked to the far wall. A pile of old blueprints had slumped to the floor. One bore Vernet's signature in the margin, because he wasn't just the family doctor. He once advised on potent legality. Clockwork used him as a second reader. He saw this cog, this device, long ago. Martin stepped back. So if he knew, and Vexley wanted it, they both had reason to recover it, and silence Lady Octavia. But the person who stole the will, Poirot added, had a different motive. They feared being disinherited, which points to someone else. Francis met Poirot's gaze. "You think it was me?" Poirot's voice was calm. "I think you are angry, that you felt betrayed. But anger does not make you a killer. Not unless it has a partner." "Francis, we must confirm one thing. The time of death, was it truly 9:36? You think it was earlier?" "I think," Poirot said, "it was later. The clock may have been stopped after she died." Martin blinked. "To manipulate the timeline?" "Exactement," Poirot said. "To fabricate an alibi." He picked up the cog one last time. "This gear," he said softly, "tells time differently. Not in minutes or hours, but in motives. And I assure you, it is ticking loudly now." Chapter 10. The whisper in the wallpaper. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in 3 days, spilling its golden light across the upper floor of Chateau Belfort, like a warm apology. But Poirot paid it no attention. He was back in the library, the site of Lady Octavia's death, alone, save for the low creak of the grandfather clock and the faint ticking of the smaller timepieces that dotted the room like sentries keeping watch. Though it was mid-morning, the curtains remained drawn, just as they had been the night she died. Poirot walked a slow circuit of the room, his patent leather shoes barely whispering against the polished wood. He stopped by the fireplace, knelt, and gently removed the fire screen. Ashes still coated the grate. Martin's men had taken the poison vial, but had left the residue behind. With the tip of his cane, Poirot stirred the cold ashes, eyes narrowing, as something caught the light, something thin and dark, coiled like a thread of hair. But it was not hair. It was wire. Delicate, blackened by flame, but unmistakably a wire filament, just under 2 inches long, with a tiny hooked end. Poirot picked it up carefully, with a handkerchief. Then he looked at the clock. He walked over to it and opened the side panel. The mechanism was pristine, too pristine. New screws, recently oiled. Someone had tampered with it, but not clumsily. No, this had been engineered. And then Poirot saw it, tucked along the inside frame, where the gear chamber met the pendulum socket. A small gouge in the wood, circular, the size of the cog he had found, but more telling was the residue around it. Black carbon, faintly sticky adhesive. Someone had affixed the cog not inside the mechanism, but against it. A false part, decorative, symbolic, a red herring. And yet, there was something else. Just below the gouge, behind the lower panel, a faint discoloration in the wallpaper caught Poirot's eye, the kind only visible in certain light. A faint outline of a rectangle. He leaned in. There had once been a hidden panel here, the sort that could be opened with the tip of a fingernail. Carefully, reverently, Poirot traced the outline, then pressed gently at the lower corner. Click. A small square popped open, no bigger than a diary page. Inside, an envelope. He withdrew it slowly. It was addressed in Lady Octavia's handwriting. To be opened by Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Only in the event of my death. Poirot paused, heart heavy. He broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Monsieur Poirot, I suspect that by the time you read this, I will have met my end. Not by fate, but by design. I cannot prove it, but I feel eyes on me. Nicholas Vexley has returned, or perhaps never truly left. But he is not alone. He has convinced someone here to help him, I am sure. The gear you found belonged to the prototype, the inverted mechanism, the one Harold locked away after our accident. Vexley claims it was his. He is right. But it was also dangerous. The device could reverse a spring's pressure without noise. In the wrong hands, it is a weapon. I no longer trust Baron Leclerc. He is too eager for closure. I also believe my nephew has lied about something. His presence perhaps the night Harold died. But it is not just about inheritance. Someone here is willing to kill to control time itself, or at least what people believe about it. You must follow the sound no one else hears, the tick that stops before it should. Octavia Worsley. Poirot folded the letter slowly, placing it in his breast pocket. His face was grave but composed. "Madam," he whispered, "you were brave and brilliant, and now I will not fail you." He stood and looked back at the grandfather clock once more. The false cog, the tampered pendulum, the adhesive, the wire in the ashes. It was all a performance. Someone had staged the death not just to hide the method, but to control the narrative. A stopped clock at 9:36 was no accident. It was theater, and Poirot now understood the scene's most overlooked element. He crossed to the bookcase behind the clock and pulled out a slim black volume, a poetry book by Tennyson, Lady Octavia's favorite. He opened the cover. Inside, a hand-scribbled note on the inside flap. He speaks without moving his lips, and yet he controls every room he enters. A quote, or a warning. Poirot smiled faintly. "Even your books spoke in riddles, madame." Just then, Violette appeared in the doorway, hesitant. "Monsieur Poirot?" "Yes, there's a visitor. He says he's expected, a Mr. Edwin Pell." Poirot blinked. "Ah," he said, brushing the dust from his sleeves. "The clock strikes early." He looked once more at the hidden letter. Then he turned to Violette. "Please have him wait in the green salon, and ensure no one else enters. I shall be with him shortly." She nodded and vanished down the corridor. Poirot stood in the library a moment longer. The truth was almost assembled, each piece like a cog in a great, terrible machine. But he would not turn the key just yet. First, he would wind the spring, and wait for the sound that came just before the crime. The whisper in the wallpaper. Chapter 11. The faces behind the masks. The green salon had once been a place of calm, a sunlit room filled with velvet chairs, painted china, and portraits of long-forgotten Worsleys. But by midday, it had become a furnace of nerves. The guests had gathered not by invitation, but by the weight of unspoken expectation. Something had shifted in the house. The air was denser. Looks lasted too long. Conversations turned brittle. Poirot entered last, closing the door behind him with the quiet click of finality. In the room, Francis Worsley, sprawled with false ease in an armchair, Baron Leclerc, standing ramrod straight by the mantel, Violette Renard, perched near the window, her hands neatly folded in her lap, Dr. Vernet, seated beside the tea trolley, polishing his glasses with more focus than required, and Yvette Morel just outside the room, listening, she thought, without being noticed. Poirot greeted them with a polite nod. "Mes amis," he said, "thank you for indulging me. It is necessary now that we speak not of what we saw, but of what we each believe others did not." A moment passed. Then Francis, with a smirk, "You're asking us to betray each other?" Poirot smiled gently. "No, monsieur, I am asking you to observe one another more honestly than you have so far. For example, Baron Leclerc, you claim to have had no knowledge of the most recent will, but you served as co-trustee. How does one not know when they are being cut out? Leclerc straightened. Lady Octavia had grown eccentric. She changed documents without warning. I was not consulted. But you were aware of the version that benefited you? Of course. She'd shared it with me personally, months ago. And yet, Poirot said, she did not sign that version. Vernet leaned forward. Why would she withhold that from him, but let you witness a new one? Poirot turned. An excellent question, Doctor. Perhaps because she no longer trusted the Baron's loyalty, or perhaps because she feared his silence could be purchased, like so many other things in this house. Francis laughed. You speak as if this is a palace of liars, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot raised a brow. Is it not? Silence. Then Violette's voice, quiet but firm. Lady Octavia feared one of you. She told me so. All heads turned, said someone had changed, that their ambition had turned sour. She didn't name them, but she looked toward the Baron when she said it. Leclerc's eyes narrowed. That's hearsay. It's also true, Violette said. Poirot did not speak. He watched, waited. The tension curled tighter. Francis stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. We all had reason to be angry with her. She played games, favored one, slighted another, changed her mind daily. But only one of you, Poirot said softly, changed the clock. Vernet frowned. The mechanism? No. The narrative. Someone altered the perception of time itself. And that takes not just access, but foresight. Poirot paced slowly. Consider, please, the sequence. A new will is signed. A visitor arrives Fexley. An envelope is burned, tea is served, curtains drawn. A woman dies, and a clock, meticulously engineered, stops at 9:36. He paused. That is not chaos. That is orchestration. Violette's fingers twitched. You're saying someone planned it, days in advance? Oui, mademoiselle. And they began by removing a single item that would change the truth if found too early. Francis's jaw tightened. The will, Poirot nodded. It was hidden, twice, once to stall its execution, the second time to buy leverage. Baron Leclerc exhaled sharply. You think I did this? Poirot tilted his head. I think you panicked. That Lady Octavia revealed something you thought would remain buried. Perhaps a financial arrangement. Perhaps knowledge of Vexley's return. I haven't seen that man in 20 years, the Baron snapped. And yet, Poirot said, his name was written in the guest book, in your hand. The room stiffened. Martine, standing quietly in the doorway now, nodded. Confirmed. Different pen, same handwriting. Leclerc's face flushed. He asked me not to announce him, said it would cause trouble. I was trying to avoid chaos. You created a different kind of chaos, Poirot said. Silence, it seems, is rarely neutral. Then, Poirot turned to Violette. You were the closest to Lady Octavia, in her final days, her confidant. You knew the contents of the new will, and you were the only one who knew both where the copy was stored, and that it had not been mailed. Violette shook her head. I didn't steal it, I swear. No, but someone tried to frame you. The envelope was placed back perfectly, but the imprint of your gloves is absent. The thief did not know you handle mail with gloves. You, mademoiselle, are innocent by the very nature of your neatness. Violette blinked. Francis scoffed. And me? Do I get a clean bill of health, too? Poirot's smile did not reach his eyes. No, monsieur. Because you were the only one who had access to the East Wing archives. The hidden gear compartment had not been disturbed in years, until last week. And your fingerprints were found on the velvet inside the case. I was curious, Francis said quickly. That doesn't make me a murderer. No, Poirot agreed. But it makes you a man with motive. And with the technical curiosity to understand just enough about how that clock worked, to break it without smashing it. Silence again, then a voice from the doorway. Yvette Morel, I saw someone, that night. All heads turned. Yvette entered slowly, wringing her hands. I didn't say before because I wasn't sure. But after I brought Madame her tea, I left through the side hall. As I passed the music room, I saw the Baron. He had gloves on, and he was holding something. A brass key, I think. Leclerc stepped forward. That proves nothing. But you told Poirot, Martin interrupted, that you didn't carry keys, that Violette had them all. Leclerc's mouth opened, then shut. Poirot nodded solemnly. There it is, the first fracture. He looked around the room. This house is full of broken clocks, each one telling a different story. But only one tells the truth. And now, mes amis, we are getting close enough to hear it tick. Chapter 12. The mistake that shouldn't have been made. The drawing room had been prepared not for comfort, but for clarity. Poirot insisted on that. All distractions removed. No brandy, no idle music, no conversation unrelated to the matter at hand. He had rearranged the furniture himself, placing 2 chairs in the center of the room, a low table between them, and 5 observers seated silently at the edges. Only the grandfather clock ticked in the corner, like a patient audience waiting for the final act. Francis Worsley sat in one of the center chairs, one leg crossed over the other, still managing a smirk. You've done well, Monsieur Poirot. The tension is delightful. But where's your proof? Poirot did not sit. He paced slowly. You are not on trial, monsieur, not yet, but you are on stage. And I find that the truth reveals itself in performance. Francis exhaled. You think I staged all of this to steal a fortune? I think, Poirot said, you were angry. You felt betrayed. And when you discovered your aunt had rewritten the will, cutting you out, you lashed out, but not blindly. No, you planned. Francis leaned forward, his voice low. Then why didn't I take the money and vanish? Because you are not a thief, Poirot said. You are something far more dangerous. A man of wounded pride. You didn't want money. You wanted legacy. Poirot paused at the table. You wanted to be the heir to the Worsley name. To the brilliance you believe was yours by blood, not merit. You thought the company should have been yours. I was family, Francis snapped. Not that she ever treated me like it. Ah, Poirot said softly. So now, the motive emerges. Poirot turned to the others. Let me show you what happened. He walked to the fireplace. The night of Lady Octavia's death, the room was arranged just as it is now. She sat here. He placed a hand on the chair's back, waiting for her evening tea. Yvette brings it. She leaves. The curtains are open. Then, someone enters, not through the main doors, but through the side hall. Quiet, controlled. Poirot walked toward the side door. They speak for a moment. Perhaps it is calm. Perhaps it is tense. But then, a distraction. The visitor asks her to rise or to fetch something from the desk, and when she turns, Poirot stopped. A substance already placed in the tea, something delayed, elegant, fatal, begins its work. Not immediate, that would be too messy. No, the death is slow, predictable. Poirot walked to the grandfather clock, and here it is, where the genius of the crime lies. The killer stops the clock, not at the time of death, but before it, creating the illusion that she died while alone, that the tea was served by Yvette. Vernet stood. You're saying someone manipulated the timeline? Oui, doctor. Precisely. And how do we know this? Poirot walked to the fireplace, again, because of the wire. He held up the fragment wrapped in cloth. This wire was fused into the lower gears. Enough to jam the pendulum, not break it, just stall it. And it was timed to stop the mechanism at 9:36. Leclerc frowned. But wouldn't that mean that the death occurred later? Poirot interrupted. Not when Yvette left, but closer to 10. Francis sat forward now. Anyone could have done that. Why me? Poirot smiled faintly. Because you are the only one who knew about the timing of Yvette's rounds. You've lived here for years. You've studied your aunt's habits. You knew she always took her tea at 8:30, that her routine was sacred, predictable. Francis stood. That's not proof. That's conjecture. Poirot tapped the letter in his pocket. Lady Octavia did not name you. She feared several people, but she suspected one person had been manipulated. That's what you do, monsieur. You do not act alone. You inspire doubt, confusion. He turned suddenly to the Baron. And you, Monsieur Leclerc, you let it happen. Leclerc froze. What? You did not poison her, but you facilitated the visitor. You signed Vexley's name in the book. You held the keys. You may have believed you were preserving the estate, removing danger, but you became an accomplice to deceit. Violette stood, voice trembling. Then who gave him the gear? That's what this is all about, isn't it? Poirot turned to her slowly. No one gave him the gear. Looked at Francis. You already had it. Francis didn't blink. Your fingerprints were on the velvet, on the internal casing. But more than that, you quoted something 3 nights ago. A phrase your uncle used. A man's soul can be measured in gears. You said it casually. Poirot paused. But that phrase is not in any of Harold Worsley's published writings. Not even in the company archives. Francis stiffened. Poirot stepped closer. It is, however, carved by hand on the underside of the prototype gearbox. The one no one has opened since 1930. Except for the killer. Francis said nothing. No one moved. Poirot's voice softened. Only the person who retrieved the gear and placed it inside the locket Lady Octavia sent to me would know that phrase. Francis's mouth opened, then shut. I meant nothing by it, he muttered. It's just something I'd heard. Poirot stepped back. You made a mistake, monsieur. A small one, but fatal. Inspector Martin stepped forward. That's enough. Francis raised his hands. You have no proof I poisoned her. No, Poirot said. He pulled a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to Martin. A copy of the toxicology report. The substance was colchicine, extracted from autumn crocus, delayed, tasteless, absorbed through the digestive tract. He looked at Vernet, and prescribed once, in small doses, by you, doctor, for gout. Vernet went pale. Poirot turned back to Francis. It was stolen from the cabinet. You used your uncle's old key. It still fit. The room was silent now. Even the clock seemed to pause. Poirot exhaled. You wanted to stop time, Monsieur Worsley, but in doing so, you showed us exactly when you acted. Francis's shoulders dropped. I only wanted what was mine. Poirot nodded, his voice low. Too many do. Chapter 13. The gears begin to spin. Too fast. The storm that had left the ground soaked days ago returned in spirit that night. Not as rain, but as wind. It howled across the chimneys of Chateau Belfort, rattling shutters and moaning through the narrow stone holes like a voice long buried. But inside, it was not the weather that disturbed the calm. It was what Francis Worsley had not said. Poirot had left the drawing room shortly after the confrontation. He knew better than to corner a wounded animal with too many eyes watching. Confessions made in public were rarely truthful, but silence often revealed the intentions behind the words that never came. Francis had not denied poisoning Lady Octavia outright. He had only denied that they could prove it, and Poirot knew that meant only one thing. He was not finished yet. It was just past midnight when Violette knocked gently at Poirot's door. She had been unable to sleep and said she'd heard something odd. Footsteps on the servants' stairwell. Poirot, already dressed, nodded solemnly and motioned for her to stay behind. Moments later, he descended the eastern corridor. Where the lights were dim and the carpets thinner, he moved silently, ears trained for the smallest irregularity. There, just at the bottom of the staircase, he heard it, the metallic clink of keys. Poirot pressed himself against the wall and waited. A figure moved into view. Francis, clad in a dark coat, a duffel bag over his shoulder. He moved swiftly, but with too much purpose for someone simply pacing from nerves. He paused outside the study, the same room Lady Octavia had used for private writing, and took out the ring of keys he was not supposed to possess. Poirot stepped forward. "Bonsoir, monsieur," he said quietly. Francis froze. He didn't turn, didn't even flinch. His shoulders simply sagged, as if he'd known this moment would come eventually. "I suppose you're going to stop me." Poirot stepped into the light. "That depends. Are you fleeing or finishing something?" Francis turned, his face unreadable. "I was retrieving a letter, that's all. Something personal, from my aunt." Poirot's gaze flicked to the duffel bag. "You pack lightly for a man not... You pack lightly for a man not leaving." Francis chuckled, bitter and quiet. "You don't understand. She was going to ruin me. That new will, she said I lacked character. She thought I was weak. All I ever wanted was her respect. She respected you more than you know," Poirot said gently. "But she feared what your pride would do when cornered." Francis exhaled. "She said I'd never build anything of my own, that I'd die inheriting dust. And so, Poirot said, stepping closer. You tried to inherit silence. A long pause. Then, Francis reached for the study door again. I have nothing left to lose now, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot's voice was calm, but firm. On the contrary, you have everything to lose, especially the dignity of choosing what remains of your story. Francis opened the door slowly. Inside, the study was as it had been. Papers stacked neatly, books shelved, the desk drawer slightly ajar. But on the blotter, a wax-sealed envelope remained. Poirot recognized it instantly. It was addressed to Edwin Pell. You were going to destroy this? Poirot asked. Francis didn't answer. He simply stared at it. That letter, Poirot continued, was her final act of truth. It names the original inventor, not Harold, not even herself. It is the only thing that clears the past. You wanted it gone because it proves she believed you unworthy of her name, not because of failure, but because of dishonor. Francis swallowed hard. And if I take it now? Poirot stepped forward. Then you'll be remembered only as a thief who tried to burn the one thing that could have absolved you. A man who thought he could control legacy by eliminating it. Francis's hands trembled. Then he laughed, a short broken sound. She always said you'd show up when the time was right, that you'd arrive late but land precisely, like a well-wound clock. Poirot stepped to the desk and picked up the letter himself. She knew I would come, because she believed in the end that truth deserves to outlast the lies, even the ones we tell ourselves. Francis sat down heavily in the desk chair. He placed the duffel bag on the floor and pressed both palms over his face. I didn't mean for her to die like that. I only wanted to scare her. I thought she'd sign it back to me. Poirot's voice softened. She already had, not the estate, but her fear, her pain, her guilt. She gave it to you, because she knew you would know what to do with it. Francis dropped his hands. And I did nothing. Poirot didn't reply. Outside, the wind struck the shutters again. A long groan echoed through the corridor. Francis stood and raised his hands in mock surrender. Well then, shall we go, detective? Poirot nodded. The inspector is waiting. Francis hesitated at the threshold. Tell me something, Poirot. Do you believe I loved her? Poirot's eyes met his without judgment. I believe you loved what she represented. But when tested, love must protect. You chose pride instead. Francis nodded once, slowly, and stepped into the hallway. Poirot lingered a moment longer, staring down at the envelope, then he slipped it into his coat. From the corner of the room, the grandfather clock ticked softly, unbroken, untouched but no longer deceived. Chapter 14. The final click beneath the silence. The sun rose quietly over Chateau Belfort, touching its rain-slicked rooftops and weathered stone with pale light. The storm had passed, leaving behind no damage, only clarity. For Hercule Poirot, clarity always arrived in the quiet moments after a confession. But confessions were not always complete. He stood in the drawing room once more, facing the grandfather clock. It had been cleaned. The side panel was restored, the adhesive wiped clean, the false gear removed and stored as evidence. The time now read correctly, ticking with precise indifference, as though it had never held a secret. Yet something still gnawed at Poirot. He had uncovered the killer, the motive, the tampering, and yet it felt unfinished. Francis's breakdown had been real. His attempt to flee, desperate. His resentment, long festering and foolish. But Poirot knew pride rarely operated alone. Pride needed validation, permission, or more dangerously, encouragement. He walked to the desk in Lady Octavia's writing room and laid out the known pieces, the forged timeline, the locket with the brass cog, the unsigned gear patents, the lost will, the mysterious visitor, Nicholas Vexley, and now the name that had lingered in the shadows from the beginning. Edwin Pell. He retrieved the sealed envelope and opened it again. Not the letter this time, but the wax seal itself. Octavia's personal crest, yes. But embedded within the wax, barely visible, was the faint indentation of another mark, circular and geometric. It wasn't just decorative. It was a stamp, a toolmaker's seal. Poirot left the room immediately. Down the corridor, past the gallery, into the old storage chamber where Lady Octavia kept things no longer needed, but never quite discarded. There, beneath the dust cloth, stood the original Worsley prototype, the triple pendulum clock, damaged but intact. Its brass housing dulled, its lower chamber locked. Poirot examined the underside once again. Yes, there it was, the same circular mark, pressed into the metal, a small emblem, a gear set within a triangle. He whispered the name aloud, Pell. And then he understood. The gear had never been intended for production. It was a signature, a private maker's mark embedded in the prototype, proof of ownership, a declaration that this design, whatever Harold Worsley claimed, had never fully belonged to him. Lady Octavia had found it long after her husband's death, perhaps hidden in the prototype, perhaps rediscovered during her final attempts at reconciliation. And she had sent it to Poirot, not as bait, but as evidence, as a warning, because someone else had wanted it gone. Not Francis, not Vexley, Dr. Vernet. The realization struck with a chill. Poirot stood motionless for several seconds, then turned and walked straight to the garden, where Vernet often sat alone, sipping coffee and pretending not to watch the house. He found him there now, hat tilted slightly, coat immaculate, legs crossed. "You're up early, Doctor," Poirot said mildly. "I never sleep well after dramatic nights," Vernet replied, not looking up. "I assume Francis is secured." "He is." "Then I suppose the case is closed." Poirot sat across from him. "Not quite. There is one thing that still troubles me." "Oh?" "The poison." Vernet finally looked at him. "I do not believe Francis had access to colchicine, not unless someone showed him how to obtain it, or gave it to him outright." Vernet's brow furrowed slightly. "I'm a Dr. Poirot. I've treated dozens of patients over the years. I can't keep track of every prescription." "But you kept track of this one," Poirot interrupted softly, "because it was never recorded. It was drawn from a private supply, one not documented, and one that Lady Octavia discovered was missing the day before she died." He removed the wax seal and held it up. "She left this for Pell. But you saw it first, didn't you? You recognized the mark. You knew she had found the truth. Vernet said nothing. Poirot's voice remained calm. You advised Harold on patents. You reviewed designs. You saw the seal 30 years ago and told him to bury it. Still silence. Poirot continued, but Octavia wouldn't bury it. She tried to make peace with the past, and you feared exposure? Your reputation, your legacy as the Worsleys' trusted family physician, destroyed by a single gear. Vernet leaned forward. Do you have proof, Poirot? Poirot looked him in the eyes. No, only motive, opportunity, and your silence at every critical moment. You knew how she died, but you waited. You let Francis take the fall, because he gave you the opening you needed. The doctor exhaled. Then, to Poirot's surprise, he smiled. You were always too clever, he said. Poirot rose slowly. And you were always too careful. But even a careful man forgets one thing. He turned to leave. Vernet's voice followed. And what's that? Poirot didn't look back. That a gear, once turned, cannot be unturned, only faced. As he walked toward the house, the wind picked up again, rustling through the hedges. It carried with it the weight of a truth finally uncovered. Not loud or violent, but steady and final, like the click of a mechanism finding its last tooth. Poirot placed the wax seal into a small envelope marked for Geneva. Some legacies are built on invention, others on silence, and some only on the courage to let the truth tick again. Chapter 15. The Room That Held Its Breath. The drawing room had been cleared of clutter, furniture arranged with ceremonial symmetry. A single window cracked open, letting in the faint scent of damp roses from the garden below. The late afternoon light cut sharp angles across the floor, catching dust motes suspended like old secrets in the air. One by one, they entered. Violette Renard, composed as ever, though the diffness in her shoulders betrayed the seat and she tried to suppress. She sat quietly to the left of the hearth, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Baron Leclerc, pinched and upright, with a small notebook tucked under his arm. His mustache twitched as if uncertain how to behave in a room where truth might actually be spoken. Yvette Morel, pale but curious, stood just within the threshold. She did not take a seat. She looked like a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone else to name the thing she couldn't. Inspector Martin, silent, alert, stationed near the door with two uniformed officers just beyond. He gave Poirot a single nod. Ready? And, finally, Dr. Paul Vernet, who entered last, fashionably late, as though attending a lecture rather than his own reckoning. He took the seat closest to the fireplace, legs crossed, cane propped against the chair. His presence was calm, measured, inevitable. Hercule Poirot stood at the center, not elevated, not theatrical, only certain. Mes amis, he began, his voice low and measured. You are here because the time has come to return the truth to its proper order. Much like a misaligned mechanism, when a single cog is out of place, everything that follows becomes distorted. He gestured toward the mantel, where the infamous grandfather clock had been wheeled from the library for one final appearance. This clock, Lady Octavia's pride, was made not merely to measure time, but to control perception. It did so once again in her final hour. But as always, time, true time, refuses to be mastered. The room was still. Poirot continued. You all know now that Lady Octavia did not die of natural causes. She was poisoned by colchicine, a substance delayed in its cruelty, masked by tea, masked again by routine, and finally masked by the illusion of time itself. He paced slowly. The mechanism in the clock was tampered with by Francis Worsley. He has confessed. He believed wrongly that his aunt's will had disinherited him unjustly. He manipulated the timeline, hoping to cast suspicion on others. And yet, Poirot stopped. He did not act alone. Heads turned. A ripple of tension passed through the room like a current snapping loose. Poirot's gaze fell on Dr. Verney. You, monsieur, provided the poison. Verney tilted his head. You've no proof of that. No, Poirot admitted. But I have the missing motive. And the missing voice. He retrieved a small folded paper from his coat. This is a signed statement from Edwin Pell, received this morning via telegram from Geneva. He confirms that the gear found inside Lady Octavia's locket, and again referenced in her final letter, bore his personal mark. A symbol he engraved into only one prototype during a joint design he developed with Nicholas Vexley. Harold Worsley saw the plans, so did his wife, but only one man advised them to suppress it for legal protection. Poirot raised his eyes. You, Dr. Verney. Verney didn't move. You were not only their physician, you were a consultant on patent rights, a trusted advisor. You helped Harold bury the truth about the invention's origin. And when Octavia rediscovered the gear, and prepared to reveal its origin to Pell, what did you do? Verney's lips twitched, but he said nothing. Poirot pressed on. You could not afford a scandal, not at your age, not after a pristine career. And so you saw an opportunity, a bitter, resentful air, a prototype no one remembered, a convenient substance you at once prescribed and kept quietly in your private kit. Poirot turned now to the others. Francis believed he was acting alone, but the true manipulation, the gentle nudge, the information about how to use the poison, the encouragement to confront Lady Octavia that night, came from Verney. Not with overt malice, no, but with just enough suggestion. Just enough implication. Long pause. Then Verney spoke, his voice low. Do you know what legacy means, Monsieur Poirot? It means your life outlives your usefulness. It means being remembered for what you preserved, not what you confessed. Poirot stepped closer. And do you know what time means, Doctor? It means that no lie survives forever. Martin moved forward, but Verney stood calmly, adjusting his cuffs. I will come quietly. Poirot watched him. You already have. As Verney center of the room. There are no victors in this house, he said softly, only survivors. He turned to Violette. You, mademoiselle, were the guardian of truth. Though you did not know its weight, you will be the executor of Lady Octavia's final wish. Her home for war widows. She chose you, because you never once sought anything more than order. To Yvette, you are free from suspicion, but not from memory. The past is a room we cannot lock forever. To Baron Leclerc, your silence, though not criminal, aided deceit. You must ask yourself whether loyalty, once misplaced, becomes cowardice. And to the clock, Poirot laid a single white glove across the polished face. It ticked falsely once. It shall not do so again. The room fell still as he turned toward the door. Outside the wind had stilled, the roses no longer swayed, and the silence was finally honest. Chapter 16. The sound that shouldn't have stopped. The great hall of Chateau Belfort had rarely seen so many eyes fixed in silent expectancy. The chandelier above, once only a symbol of aristocratic grandeur, now seemed to cast a judgmental glow upon those below. Every creak of the wooden floor, every shift in the chairs, became amplified. Little reminders that time still moved forward, even as Hercule Poirot prepared to walk them all back to the moment it stood still. He stood in front of the fireplace, his hands clasped neatly. There was no paper in his hands, no notes to guide him, only memory, logic, and the keen rhythm of truth. Mes amis, he began, in every crime, there are two timelines, the one we see, and the one that actually occurred. Tonight, I shall show you both. All eyes turned toward him. Inspector Martin stood by the side wall, arms folded, watchful. Yvette clutched her apron. Violette sat utterly still. Baron Leclerc looked like a man who wished he'd stayed in bed. And beside the door, Francis Worsley sat, wrists still cuffed but expression now strangely serene. Poirot turned toward the grandfather clock. This, he said, tapping its smooth casing, was not merely a timepiece, it was the stage prop, the weapon of illusion. He looked to the room. Let us begin. At 8:30 p.m., Yvette Morel brought Lady Octavia her chamomile tea, as she did each evening. It contained, unknown to her, a slow-acting dose of colchicine, administered, earlier, by someone with access and knowledge. Lady Octavia drank it. He paused. Now, you may ask, why didn't she notice anything unusual? Because the poison is subtle. It begins as unease, then drowsiness, then collapses the heart. It takes time, perhaps 30, 40 minutes. And so at 8:45, she was still very much alive, which gave the true conspirator time to act. He turned toward Francis. You entered the room at 9. You knew what to do. You'd been given just enough information to believe you were in control. You did not see yourself as a killer, but as an heir reclaiming what was his. The gear had been found. The will had been changed. You were cut out, and you were angry. You tampered with the clock, not randomly, deliberately. Poirot walked to the timepiece. You knew enough about your uncle's designs to insert a filament into the mechanism, a small wire, measured precisely to halt the pendulum. At 9:36, let the silence stretch. You did not kill her, Francis. You framed the hour of her death. Francis said nothing. He stared at the floor. Poirot turned next to Dr. Volney, seated now among the gendarmes, his face blank. But the poison did not come from Francis. It came from you. Gasps, movement. Yvette clutched the back of her chair. You, Doctor, were the real clockmaker in this story. You wound the spring so carefully, so quietly. You had access. You had the poison. And more than that, you had the fear. Poirot moved slowly now, letting the words fall with gravity. You feared what Lady Octavia had uncovered. That the gear she found bore a mark. Not Worsley's, But Pell's, the man whose designs were stolen, the man who had trusted Harold Bunce and been betrayed. He reached into his coat and retrieved the brass cock. He held it up between two fingers. This gear proves the original design was never Harold's alone. You were the legal advisor, the keeper of secrets, and if this surfaced, your name, your reputation, would be tied to a deception decades old. He placed the cog gently on the mantel. So you nudged a vulnerable young man. You fed him just enough truth, encouraged his resentment, and when he moved to act, you waited. Poirot faced the room fully now. You let him adjust the clock. You let him believe he was authoring his revenge. And when Lady Octavia fell, you were the first to examine her, and the first to say, natural causes. He turned back to Francis. You believed you were the mastermind. In truth, you were the final gear. Francis's lips parted, but no defense came. Poirot took a deep breath. Lady Octavia suspected the truth. That is why she wrote me. That is why she hid the letter. That is why she attempted to reach Pell. But she hesitated. She still believed in mercy, even for those who no longer deserved it. He walked once more to the fireplace. She died not of a poison, nor of betrayal, but of something more tragic. He looked at them all. She died hoping the past would not repeat itself. That silence at last would not win. The room fell silent. Only the steady ticking of the grandfather clock echoed in the stillness. Poirot turned to Inspector Martin. The case is concluded. The evidence has been sent to Geneva. The handwriting, the gear, the letter, all corroborated. Martin gave a solemn nod. Poirot looked to Violette. You will find the remaining letters in the desk drawer. Unsent but truthful. Her final days were not bitter. They were brave. Violette nodded, tears forming. Poirot bowed slightly to the room. Then, with great care, he stepped over to the clock, placed one hand on its casing, and opened the glass. He set the time back to midnight. Then, with a quiet flick of his fingers, he wound the pendulum, and the ticking began again. Chapter 17. The Turning of the Key. It was late evening when the gendarmerie car departed Chateau Belfort, its red tail lights disappearing into the mist-shrouded woods. Inside sat Dr. Paul Vernet, silent, composed, hands folded over a medical journal he hadn't read in years. He had not resisted arrest, nor spoken a word since Poirot's final statement. His expression remained unreadable. Some men scream when exposed, others accept the end like the closing of a ledger. Inside the estate, quiet had returned, but not the peace that once lived in its great rooms. That, Poirot knew, would take much longer to restore. He sat in the morning room with Inspector Martin. The fire was low. A tray of untouched tea sat between them. You got them both, Martin said finally. Worsley and Vernet. Poirot stirred his cup, though he did not drink. Justice is not always symmetrical, mon ami. Francis will face charges of tampering with evidence, fraud, and conspiracy. He did not kill, but he helped shape a death. And to Vernet, Poirot's voice lowered. Manslaughter at the least. Perhaps second-degree murder, depending on what he admits. The poison, the manipulation. These were acts of intention. He didn't need to hold the teacup to be guilty. He held the match. Martin leaned back, rubbing his eyes. It still feels unreal that a man like Vernet, so respected, could engineer something so cold. Poirot's gaze turned thoughtful. People like him are the most dangerous, ones who kill not out of impulse, but to preserve a version of themselves, not for greed, but legacy. The inspector didn't respond. Some truths didn't need commentary. Elsewhere in the house, the staff had begun dismantling the remnants of Lady Octavia's gala, the one that had never truly taken place, the gold-rimmed glassware, the leftover canapes, now stale and sad, the candles burned down to wax puddles on mirrored trays. It had been meant to be a farewell. It had become a stage for revelation. In the West Wing, Violette Renard stood in Lady Octavia's writing room, sorting through papers. The fireplace remained dark, but the desk lamp cast a pool of light over her gloved fingers. She worked slowly, reverently. There were drafts of letters never sent, notes scribbled in margins, and small slips of paper bearing Lady Octavia's precise, slanted hand. Truth is the only thing that tells time correctly. Harold feared silence. I married him anyway. The tick in the clock is also the tick of regret. She set them aside gently. Yvette entered with a tray of tea and placed it without a word. Violette looked up and smiled faintly. She trusted you, she said. Yvette blinked, then looked down. She frightened me more than she trusted me. She frightened all of us, Violette replied, but not because she was cruel, because she expected us to be better than we were. The two women shared a glance, one not of shared grief, but of shared understanding. Downstairs, Poirot wandered the long corridor that led to the conservatory. Outside, the garden glistened with dew, the hedges freshly trimmed, the rose beds newly mulched. For all its wounds, the estate endured. He stopped before a tall arched window and looked toward the distant hills. Then slowly, he retrieved something from his coat pocket. The brass cog. It no longer gleamed. Its edges were dulled by time and truth, but it remained whole. Poirot turned it over in his hand, admiring the engraving. Hell's mark, unmistakable. Now, he would send it to Geneva. Hell would preserve it as part of the design's true legacy, not as a tool of murder, but as a fragment of truth restored. Behind him, Martin approached, leaving soon. We, Poirot said, still gazing out. The train departs in 2 hours. Martin nodded. You'll be missed. Poirot smiled faintly. I doubt it, but the clocks at least shall run on time. Martin chuckled, then sobered. And what about the Worsley name? The company? Francis will likely lose any claim to it, Poirot replied. Lady Octavia's foundation will inherit what remains. The board will be restructured, and the truth about the prototype will find its way into the archives. He slipped the cog back into his pocket. Sometimes, he said, a legacy must be broken before it can be rebuilt. A long silence passed between them. Then Martin offered his hand. Thank you. Poirot shook it. Au revoir, mon ami. The carriage that took him to the station was quiet. The road curved gently through the misty countryside, past crumbling stone walls, grazing sheep, and distant steeples barely visible against the horizon. Poirot sat with his hat in his lap, watching the fields blur. He was tired, not from the investigation, but from the weight of human contradiction. They had killed for truth. They had lied for legacy. And in the end, all of it came back to a single stopped clock. A symbol so precise, so seemingly innocuous, and yet so deadly. As the train whistle blew in the distance, Poirot thought of Lady Octavia, her final evening, her composed silence, her last act of clarity. She had not feared death, she had feared being forgotten. But she would not be, not now, not ever. Chapter 18. The Clock That Remembered. The train to Paris cut through the French countryside, like a line drawn on parchment. Elegant, steady, inevitable. In the first-class carriage, Hercule Poirot sat alone. Back straight, shoes polished to a mirror gleam, a small notebook resting on his lap. Outside the window, the world passed in fields and forests, in blurred glimpses of quiet lives. But Poirot's gaze was turned inward. He was not a man to gloat, nor one to brood, but reflection. That was his companion. Lady Octavia Worsley had not summoned him out of fear, not truly. She had summoned him out of precision. She knew the machinery of her world was faltering. The gears of her legacy were slipping. And she had known only one man might see the fine workings beneath the lie. It had not been a crime of passion. Not rage, not desperation, no. The death of Lady Octavia was a crime of philosophy. She had become to two men a symbol of something unbearable. To Francis Worsley, she was rejection, proof that blood did not guarantee destiny. That family meant obligation, not inheritance. To Dr. Vernet, she was memory, a ticking reminder of a choice made long ago, to hide the truth rather than confront it. And in the middle sat a cog, a simple piece of brass, not dangerous in itself, not sharp, not poisonous, just proof, the kind of proof that ruins narratives. Poirot opened his notebook and reviewed the last entry he had made at Belfort. A man may wind a clock and think he controls time, but time is not wound, it is witnessed. He closed the notebook gently. He thought of Violette Renard, now executor of Octavia's estate. She would do well. She understood order and restraint. Two qualities the world no longer rewarded, but still desperately needed. He thought of Yvette, who had been the first to scream, the first to grieve. She had been dismissed by many, but it was her constancy, her quiet loyalty, that had kept the house human. She would be offered a place at the foundation. Poirot had suggested it. He thought of Baron Leclerc, who had not killed, but who had been complicit. Silence, Poirot believed, could be as sharp as any blade. But it was not his place to judge the Baron beyond that. Life, it seemed, would do the judging for him. And lastly, he thought of Francis. Poirot did not pity the man, but he understood him. Francis had wanted so badly to be the next chapter of a family legacy. He had confused inheritance with identity. It had never occurred to him that the greatest legacies are not passed down. They are rebuilt. He had asked Poirot one final question before being taken into custody. "Do you think she ever loved me?" Poirot had not answered then. But now, in the solitude of the train, he thought he might know. Yes, she had loved him, but she had also known what kind of love allows truth to come before loyalty, the kind that lets go. He reached into his coat and removed the gear once more. Its edges were worn smooth, its grooves fine and exact. In the hands of a craftsman, it could start a masterpiece. In the hands of the unworthy, it could do nothing. He placed it on the small table beside him. The train passed through a tunnel, and the cabin darkened for a brief moment. When the light returned, Poirot looked out once more. Somewhere far behind him, Belfort had resumed its quiet routines. The clocks ticked, the roses bloomed, and the truth, at long last, had found its rhythm. He allowed himself a small smile, then he rose, gathered his belongings, and adjusted his cuffs. Because time, even for Hercule Poirot, does not stop. It only pauses. For a man to listen to what the ticking truly means, Hercule Poirot will return. End.